And we are joined now in the studio by Petr Čermák, Research Fellow at the Association for International Affairs. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for joining.
Good evening.
So let's take a look at Montenegro, shall we? We know that the Montenegrin parliament has passed all necessary laws to receive a positive report from the European Commission. The country, according to official information, is meeting the criteria in chapters 23 and 24, which cover the rule of law and the judiciary reforms. But for those of our viewers who are not very much into Montenegrin politics, how about you give us a short breakdown of what it practically means, these criteria, chapter 23 and 24?
Well, I think we need to see it in a broader picture. These two chapters, 23 and 24, which are focused on, as you said, on judiciary and rule of law, are two of in total 35 chapters, which Montenegro needs to negotiate and close on its way into the EU. So purely quantitatively, it might seem to be a very small portion of work which Montenegro has to do, but also these two chapters have been probably the most difficult one for Montenegro, because the lack of rule of law, let's say, and problems in the field of judiciary related to corruption and links from the state to organized crime, possibly, were one of the major limits of the whole process of Montenegrin EU integration. So these are only two chapters, but very important ones.
Important chapters. We know of the meeting of Ursula von der Leyen with Jakov Milatovic, and she said that Montenegro is a leader when it comes to the EU enlargement. When do you think this could possibly take place, and what does it really depend on as of now?
Well, this is $1 million question. There have been multiple dates set by the EU decision makers, also by regional politicians. But as for now, it's very unpredictable what could be possibly the date of the actual EU accession of Montenegro. It's true that Montenegro is probably closest to the EU from the whole region, from the Western Balkans, from the 6 states which applied for EU membership. But still, it has a lot of tasks to do, and I cannot imagine that Montenegro will be joining the EU in the next couple of years. It will probably take longer, and most importantly, this will depend on political will, not only in Montenegro, but also in the EU, which means, as we know, political will of many EU member states, which might be more skeptical towards enlarging in the Western Balkans.
If you were to point out one of the biggest challenges for Montenegro as of now, which one would it be? Just one.
Polarization of society. Montenegro is one of the states in the Western Balkans which does not have such a big problem with, let's say, ethnic divisions. But still, the society is very much polarized after the recent rounds of elections. And there is a lot of mistrust between two parts of society. One, let's say, inclining more towards Montenegrin nationalism, and another one which is oriented more pro-Serbian. So we see that ethnic divisions and identitary divisions are actually growing in Montenegro, and these are translated into the political landscape. And this leads to a lot of polarization on the political scene, which, of course, has its implications for the process of EU enlargement.
And so we spoke about the challenge. What's the leverage for Montenegro among those other countries, neighboring countries, that could potentially, in the future, look for the accession into the EU?
Well, this is actually related to the polarization which I described, because there are many issues which are dividing the two leading political forces, let's say, or the two parts of society. But there is actually a strong agreement between the two parts of society that European integration is a priority for the country. So this is also what probably allowed the Parliament of Montenegro in the recent days to adopt the necessary laws. Because despite all the divisions the political parties have on their identity and possibly also foreign policy, they can ultimately agree on the major priority, and this is EU integration.
As we're looking at Montenegro over the past few years, there's been a somewhat unregulated influx of Russian citizens and investment. So if Montenegro, let's say that Montenegro would be to join the EU, wouldn't it be allowing more Russian influence into the EU structures? And how do you think that the EU Parliament would actually position itself to that very matter?
Well, you are right that the presence of Russian citizens and Russian capital and Russian influence in Montenegro has been pronounced historically over the last decades. There was an attempt for a political coup a few years ago, which was probably directed from Moscow. But I also think that after these events, Montenegrin institutions, as well as Montenegrin partners outside of the country, started to follow very closely these networks of Russian actors. And this is also one of the advantages of Montenegro, that this is a very small country. So I assume that the Russian presence in such a small country, with the help of the Western partners, would be under control.
That's an interesting viewpoint. We know that Montenegro and Serbia used to be one federation. We know that Montenegro actually removed itself from that equation and is somewhat ahead of Serbia in terms of EU enlargement. As of the last 2 weeks, we know that Serbia actually had some talks with Xi Jinping. So there's definitely that influence that is also related to Russia. Why do you think that Montenegro happens to be ahead of Serbia after the split?
Serbia and Montenegro are in completely different position when we talk about their foreign policy in general. Serbia, as the largest country in the Western Balkans, has an ambition to have a very strong and independent foreign policy. And for Serbia, the EU as a partner and EU integration as a goal is just one part of its foreign policy. It's also maintaining quite good relations with Russia, as you mentioned, with China. And Serbia considers itself to be a regional power in the Western Balkans. In contrast to that, Montenegro, as I said, is a very small country with limited capabilities and limited options in foreign policy, decided to go ahead with the EU integration as actually the only priority for its foreign policy. So it doesn't have so much options also because of the lack of capability.
It seems that the EU parliamentary elections and the results of thereof are going to be somewhat important for Montenegro as well, and we'll be reporting more on that. Petr Čermák, thank you so much for joining.